Every night, Sarah Collins washed the same untouched plate. Every night, she smiled at her son and said the same soft lie. "I already ate, sweetheart. Finish yours."
Just fine, thank you.
She believed no one was watching closely enough to notice. She was wrong. Across the room, a rancher named Jack Dawson set down his spoon halfway through his own supper. He knew that sentence. He had heard it before, years ago, from his own mother, in a winter that had nearly buried them both. And he knew, the way a person only knows a thing they have lived through themselves, that Sarah Collins was starving in front of a full table. Cedar Creek, Wyoming Territory. October, 1887. The boarding house smelled of wood smoke, boiled coffee, and wet wool drying too close to the stove. Rain tapped the windows in a steady rhythm that made the lanterns swing gently on their hooks. At the long supper table, ranch hands and travelers hunched over bowls of stew, spoons scraping tin, voices low and tired from a day fighting the first cold snap of the season. Sarah Collins sat with her 8-year-old son, Noah, at the far end of the table, away from the noise, in the seat closest to the door where a body could leave quickly if the room got to feeling too crowded. She had counted her coins twice before ordering, laying them out flat on her palm under the table where no one could see her do it, and twice the number had come out the same. Enough for one bowl. Not two. She set the bowl down in front of Noah and pushed her own empty plate toward the center of the table, where the lamplight barely reached it. "Eat up, Noah. I already had mine in the kitchen while I was talking with Mrs. Reed about the mending work." Noah looked at her plate. Then at her hands, folded and still in her lap. Then back at his stew, and he ate, because he was 8, and because his mother's voice never once wavered when she lied. She had gotten good at lying the way people get good at anything they have to do every single day. At the corner of the room, a man in a weathered coat and wide-brimmed hat sat by himself, a bowl of stew cooling in front of him, untouched for reasons of his own. Jack Dawson had ridden into Cedar Creek that morning to buy supplies before the mountain passes closed for winter, and he'd planned on nothing more complicated than a hot meal and an early bed. But he noticed her anyway. He noticed the way Sarah's hand stayed folded instead of reaching for a spoon. He noticed that this was the third night running he'd seen her do exactly the same thing, in exactly the same seat, with exactly the same excuse offered in exactly the same steady voice, as if she'd rehearsed it in front of a mirror until the words stopped sounding like a lie even to her. He recognized it, because he had grown up watching his own mother do it. Jack's mother had told that same lie through 2 winters when he was a boy, back when their own homestead had come within a bad month of losing everything. He remembered the exact tone of her voice, warm and unhurried, built to reassure a hungry child rather than convince a grown man. He had believed her at the time. It took him years, and a hollow feeling in his own gut he never quite forgot, to understand what she'd actually been doing. That single moment of recognition, an ordinary supper in an ordinary boarding house, would change 3 lives before the snow melted off Cedar Creek. 6 months earlier, Sarah Collins had been a rancher's wife with a house, a herd, and a husband who still made her laugh after 5 years of marriage. Ben Collins had filed his claim the same spring he married her, 160 acres of grass and creek water that he swore, with the stubborn hope of every homesteader before him, would be enough to build a life on. For 5 years, it was enough. There were dry summers and hard springs, the ordinary troubles of ranching in a territory that gave nothing away for free, but there was also a house with curtains Sarah had sewn herself, a garden that fed them through most winters, and a boy born the 2nd year of their marriage who grew up chasing chickens across the yard and falling asleep against his father's shoulder by the fire. Then came the winter the old-timers still talked about in low voices around any stove in the territory. Snow came early and stayed late. Cattle froze standing upright in the coulees, whole herds simply gone by the time the thaw let anyone go looking. Ben Collins lost most of his stock that season, the way half the ranchers in the territory did, and he did what most of them did afterward. He borrowed heavy against the homestead to rebuild the herd, worked himself past exhaustion trying to make up the loss before the note came due, and by the time autumn rolled around again, a fever caught him with nothing left to fight it. Sarah buried her husband on a hillside overlooking the creek he'd named their claim for. She did not cry in front of Noah. She made herself a private rule about that the day of the funeral, standing over the fresh dirt with her son's small hand gripped tight in hers, and she kept that rule every single day after, no matter what it cost her to keep it. The bank did not care about rules of grief. Ben's note came due that winter regardless of who was left standing to pay it, and a widow's name on a homestead claim carried little weight against a dead man's signature on a loan. Sarah signed the papers that surrendered the land with a steadiness that surprised even the banker handling the transaction. She packed what she and Noah could carry into a single trunk and set out for Cedar Creek before the roads froze shut for the season, leaving behind the curtains and the garden and every ordinary thing that had once made a house into a home. They arrived in Cedar Creek with that single trunk and less money than either of them liked to admit out loud. Sarah found a small room above the boarding house and took in mending and washing to pay for it, working her hands raw by lamplight most nights after Noah had gone to sleep. It was never quite enough. So she began doing the arithmetic that mothers have done since the beginning of time, in every hard winter, in every hungry season. One bowl of stew fed one child completely, or it fed two people half as well. She chose Noah, every single night, without ever once discussing the choice with him, and she called it breakfast she'd already had, or a headache that killed her appetite, or simply, I already ate. Noah was 8, not stupid. Children notice more than grown people ever give them credit for. He began to notice the untouched biscuit stacked at the edge of her plate. He noticed his mother always waited until his bowl was completely empty before she cleared the table, so there would be nothing left on it worth arguing about. He noticed she had grown thinner than she'd been at the funeral, her wrists narrower under her cuffs, her collarbone sharper against the fabric of her dress. He said nothing about any of it, because his father's last words to him, whispered in a voice already fading towards something Noah didn't fully understand yet, had been simple and clear. Take care of your mama, Noah. She won't ask for help, not even when she needs it. So you watch, and you don't let her know you're watching. Noah kept that promise the only way an 8-year-old boy can keep a promise that size. He pretended to believe the lie every single night, so his mother would never know that he already knew the truth, and he carried the weight of that secret the way children carry things they've decided are too important to put down. On the third night, Jack Dawson did something he hadn't planned on doing when he sat down for supper. He picked up his hat, crossed the room, and stopped beside Sarah's table. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat, polite as any stranger. "Mind if I ask you something plain?" Sarah's spine straightened the way it did whenever she expected trouble from a man she didn't know. "Depends entirely on the question." "You've had an empty plate 3 nights running," Jack said, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry past their table. "I'm not blind, and I wasn't raised foolish. I know what a woman looks like when she's giving her food to her boy and calling it something else." Sarah's face went hot with a mixture of shame and fury that made her want to throw the empty plate at him. "That is none of your concern, Mr. Dawson. Jack Dawson." He didn't flinch from her tone, and he didn't back away either. "You're right, ma'am, it's none of my business how you feed your own family. But I run a ranch 3 miles out that's short a cook and short a hand willing to do mending and washing for the bunkhouse crew. Pays fair wages, room included, and meals included whether you eat them in front of me or somewhere private. I'm not offering charity, Mrs. Collins," Sarah said, before she could stop herself. "Sarah Collins. I'm offering work, Mrs. Collins. Nothing more, nothing less." Sarah wanted to refuse on principle alone. Pride was one of the last things the winter hadn't managed to take from her, and she guarded it fiercely, the way people guard the one thing they have left. But she looked at Noah across the table, watching the exchange with the careful blankness of a child who has learned not to hope out loud, and she thought about how many more nights she could keep doing arithmetic with one bowl of stew before the arithmetic simply stopped working. "I don't take charity," she said, mostly to remind herself. "Good," Jack said. "Because I'm not offering any. I'm offering a job. Turn it down if the wages insult you. They won't." She accepted 3 days later, once her pride had argued itself into exhaustion and Noah's stomach had growled loud enough during supper to embarrass them both. Dawson Ranch sat in a wide valley below a line of dark pines, a working cattle operation with a bunkhouse full of hands, a foreman named Tom Harper who eyed the new arrangement with open suspicion from the first morning, and a boy about Noah's age named Luke Harper, Tom's nephew, who decided within an hour of meeting Noah that they were going to be friends whether Noah liked it or not. "You ever seen a real live badger?" Luke asked Noah on their first afternoon, without so much as introducing himself first. "No." "Good. I'll show you where one lives, and my Uncle Tom don't need to know we went looking." Martha Reed, who had cooked for the ranch since before Jack's own father passed, took one look at Sarah's thin wrists and made a decision about her within the first hour, the same decision Jack had made 3 nights earlier in the boarding house. She said nothing about it out loud. She simply began serving Sarah's plate first at every meal, and serving it heavy, and daring anyone at that table with a raised eyebrow to say a single word about it. For a while, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Sarah ate. Color came back into her face, and the hollows under her eyes began to fill in. Noah laughed more in his first month at Dawson Ranch than he had in the entire year since his father died, running wild across the yard with Luke Harper until Tom hollered at the both of them to quit spooking the horses before somebody got kicked. Jack watched all of it from a careful distance, telling himself it was nothing more than an employer's ordinary satisfaction in seeing his hired help settle in and thrive. He was not a very convincing liar, not even to himself, and Martha Reed told him so more than once, usually while handing him a second helping of biscuits he hadn't asked for. "You're staring again," she told him one evening, not even bothering to look up from the stove. "I'm not staring. I'm supervising." "Supervising what, exactly?" "The way she cuts her potatoes?" Jack had no good answer for that, and Martha's laugh followed him clear out the winter tightened its grip on the valley the way it always did in Wyoming territory, without patience and without mercy. Supplies that had seemed plentiful in October grew thin by December, the way supplies always do on a working ranch trying to feed a bunkhouse full of hands and 2 extra mouths through a long, hard season. The ranch itself was solvent, but not wealthy, and Jack made the hard calls a responsible owner has to make when feed and food both need stretching thinner than anyone would like. Sarah noticed the smaller portions before anyone had to explain them to her. Old habits, the kind carved deep by a full year of hunger, came back easier than anyone would have wished. She began, quietly, without telling a single soul, to eat less again. A smaller helping here, always passed off as simply not being hungry. A skipped breakfast there, always with some excuse ready before anyone could ask a question. Jack noticed within the week, because he had spent his whole life learning to notice exactly that. He said nothing to her directly about it, understanding by now that cornering Sarah Collins about her pride only ever made her dig in harder, the way a stubborn horse digs in against a rope pulled too tight. Instead, he did what he'd once seen his own mother's neighbors do for her, long ago, in a winter every bit as hard as this one. He started making mistakes in the kitchen. Suddenly there was always a little extra stew that would go to waste if somebody didn't eat it. Suddenly he'd baked too many biscuits and insisted Sarah take the extras home for Noah, though everyone at that table knew perfectly well that Jack Dawson had never once baked a biscuit in his entire life, a fact that Martha Reed's raised eyebrow confirmed every single time he tried the trick. "You burned these on purpose so I'd have to throw them out," Martha said one morning, holding up a tray of biscuits that were, in fact, not burned at all. "Might have," Jack said. "Keep pretending you can't cook, Jack Dawson. Nobody's fooled but you." Sarah knew exactly what he was doing, every single time. She let him do it anyway, because it let her keep the one thing she needed most in the world, the ability to tell herself she hadn't actually asked anyone for help. Noah, for his part, kept his own quiet vigil through it all. He watched his mother's plate the same way he had back in the boarding house, and he said nothing, because the promise he'd made his father was still the only thing in the world that felt solid under his feet. Between chores and cold mornings, something else was growing in the ranch house that nobody had bothered to give a name to yet. Sarah and Jack found themselves lingering longer over the evening dishes than either of them had planned, talking about small things and then, slowly, about larger ones. He asked about Ben, gently, and she found she could finally say her husband's name out loud without her voice cracking on it. She asked about his mother, and Jack told her, for the first time in years, about the winter his family had nearly lost everything, and about the neighbor woman 2 farms over who had started, accidentally, bringing extra bread until his mother's ribs stopped showing through the fabric of her dress. Somebody helped her, Sarah said quietly. Without ever once making her feel small about needing it. That's the only kind of help worth giving, Jack said. The other kind just costs a person their pride for nothing in return. Neither of them said the word that had begun building steadily between them, the way frost builds on a window overnight, unnoticed until suddenly the whole pane is covered. But on the night Jack walked Sarah back to her room above the old bunkhouse storage, lantern light catching the frost already forming on the porch rail, he took her hand for just a moment longer than the errand strictly required, and neither one of them pulled away first. There was laughter in those weeks too, plenty of it. Luke Harper talked Noah into an ill-advised attempt to ride a particularly stubborn ranch goat, which ended with both boys covered in mud and Tom Harper laughing so hard at the sight of it that he had to sit down on a fence rail to recover. Martha Reed ran a running joke through the whole bunkhouse about Jack's biscuit baking skills that had every hand grinning by supper time. For the first time in over a year, Sarah Collins found herself laughing at something without immediately feeling guilty for the sound of it. One evening in late December, snow falling thick and silent outside the ranch house windows, Jack found Sarah standing on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket, watching her breath cloud in the cold. He came out without his coat, which she pointed out immediately. "You'll catch your death standing out here without a coat, Jack Dawson. Funny thing for you to say, considering the winter you've had." She almost argued with him. Instead, she lifted one corner of her blanket, a small and wordless invitation, and he stepped in close enough to share it, close enough that neither of them was thinking about the cold anymore. They stood like that a long while, not talking, the snow coming down soft around the porch lantern, and something settled between them that neither one needed to put a name to yet. "My mother used to say the hardest winters show a person who their neighbors really are," Jack said quietly. "I didn't fully understand her until I met you." "Is that a compliment, Mr. Dawson?" "It's the truest thing I know how to say to you right now." Sarah tipped her head against his shoulder, and for the length of one long winter breath, she let herself simply be held, without calculating what it cost her, without a single lie standing between them. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday, in a buggy that had clearly never been built with frontier roads in mind, driven by a man named Walter Briggs. Briggs represented the bank that had once held Ben Collins' note, and he arrived at Dawson Ranch with Deputy Earl Turner riding alongside him and a leather folder full of papers claiming that Ben's old debt had never been fully settled after all. According to Briggs, the remaining balance, with several years of compounded interest quietly attached, now entitled the bank to garnish any wages earned by the debtor's widow, plus a portion of the livestock still connected to the original claim. Jack read the papers twice through and didn't like the arithmetic any better the second time. This debt was settled in full when the land was surrendered. "I'll swear to that in front of any judge in the territory." The land covered the principal balance, Briggs said smoothly, the way a man talks when he said the same sentence to a dozen other frightened people before this one. Interest continued to accrue afterward. "It's all properly filed here, Mr. Dawson, nothing improper about any of it." Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, listening, feeling the floor shift under her the exact same way it had the week Ben died. She understood, with sudden and total clarity, what would happen next if she stayed at Dawson Ranch even one more month. The bank would come after Jack's own operation through her wages, piece by piece, until they had taken everything Jack had spent years building, all to satisfy a debt that had already buried her husband once. She would not let it bury Jack too. Not after everything he'd already given her without ever once asking for anything back. That night, long before sunrise, Sarah packed the single trunk that had carried her whole life from Cedar Creek to the ranch, and she began writing a note explaining that she was leaving for both Noah's sake and Jack's. She never finished writing it, because Noah woke up in the dark and found her packing by lamplight. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question, and his voice cracked in a way that stopped Sarah's hands cold. "I have to, Noah. If I stay, that man is going to take everything from Jack because of Papa's old debt. I won't let that happen to him. Not to anyone else." Something in Noah broke loose that had been held together, carefully, for over a year. "I know you don't eat, Mama. I've always known. Every single night since the funeral, I watched you push your plate toward me and I never said one word about it, because Papa told me to take care of you and not let you know I was watching. But I can't watch you disappear too. Please don't make me keep this promise all by myself." Sarah sank to her knees in front of her son, right there on the cold floorboards, and for the first time since Ben's funeral, she let herself cry in front of him, openly, without one bit of her private rule left standing. Word of Sarah's near departure reached Jack before full dawn, carried by a wide-eyed Luke Harper who'd overheard the whole confession through a thin bunkhouse wall and gone straight to find Jack out at the corral. Jack found Sarah still in the yard, trunk half-loaded onto a borrowed cart, her eyes red and her hands shaking in the cold. "You weren't even going to say goodbye," he said. "I was trying to protect you, Jack." "I don't need protecting from a debt that isn't even real," Jack said, closing the distance between them. "What I need is for you to stop running the second something gets hard. Let somebody else carry a load with you for once in your life, Sarah. That's not weakness. I promise you it isn't." He spent the rest of that night, and most of the following day, going through old homestead records with the county clerk, cross-referencing every single figure in Briggs' folder against the original filing on Ben's claim line by line. What he found confirmed exactly what his gut had told him from the very first reading. Walter Briggs had been quietly padding the debts of widows and struggling homesteaders across 3 counties, banking on grief and unfamiliarity with legal paperwork to keep anyone from checking his arithmetic too closely. Jack called for a public meeting at the Cedar Creek Assembly Hall, inviting the county judge, half the ranchers in the valley, and Walter Briggs himself, who arrived fully confident that no rancher's word would ever carry more weight in that room than a bank's official paperwork. He was wrong, and it took less than 20 minutes for the whole room to see it. Jack laid the original filing side by side with Briggs' padded figures, along with county clerk records confirming that the original debt had, in fact, been settled completely the day the land was surrendered. He called forward 2 other widows from the valley who had received nearly identical letters from Briggs over the past year, both of whom had quietly paid inflated sums out of fear rather than risk losing what little they had left to their names. Deputy Earl Turner, who had ridden along with Briggs mostly out of habit and had never much cared for the man's manner, read through every document himself, his jaw tightening a little more with each page. "I won't stand behind paperwork I can't defend in front of decent people," Earl said finally, and stepped away from Briggs' side, right there in front of the entire hall. Briggs tried to bluster his way through it, insisting the interest calculations were nothing more than standard banking practice. But standing alone, without the deputy's authority at his shoulder, and facing a room full of ranchers who had just listened to 2 widows describe being frightened into paying money they never actually owed, his confidence collapsed a great deal faster than it had ever been built. For a tense moment, it looked as though Briggs might simply walk out of the hall and ride for the county line before anyone could stop him. He gathered his folder, straightened his coat, and moved toward the door with the stiff dignity of a man pretending he still had somewhere respectable to be. Mr. Briggs. The judge's voice carried easily across the packed room. You'll find the door considerably harder to reach than it looks, given the number of witnesses in this hall tonight. Sit down. Briggs sat down. The county judge ordered an immediate audit of every debt Briggs had filed across the territory that year, and suspended his authority to collect on any of them until the audit was complete. Walter Briggs left the assembly hall that evening considerably less certain of his future than he had been that morning, and considerably more aware of exactly how many people in Cedar Creek territory were now watching him. Sarah stood at the back of the hall through every minute of it, Noah's small hand gripped tight in hers, watching a debt that had haunted her for over a year finally come apart in front of witnesses who mattered. When the room began to empty, Tom Harper leaned over to Jack with a grin that undercut the whole serious evening. "Reckon you just made yourself the most talked-about man in 3 counties, Tom said. "I'd rather be talked about for this than for my biscuits," Jack said, and even Martha Reed, standing nearby, laughed loud enough to turn heads. Spring came to the valley slower than anyone wanted it to, the way it always does after a hard winter, but it came all the same. The audit cleared Sarah of any remaining debt entirely, and cleared 2 other widows besides, and Walter Briggs left Cedar Creek territory with considerably fewer prospects than he'd arrived with the previous autumn. Jack did not propose to Sarah the week after the hearing, though half the ranch hands were already placing quiet bets on exactly how soon he would. Instead, on a warm evening with the windows thrown open and the smell of new grass coming up through the whole valley, he asked her something harder first. "I'm not going to ask you to marry me tonight," he said, standing with her on the same porch where he'd once held her hand a moment too long, "because I want to ask you something more difficult before that. Will you let someone care for you the way you've spent this whole year caring for everyone around you? Will you let me be that person, Sarah? Not because you need saving. Because you deserve it, plain and simple." Sarah didn't answer right away. She thought about every plate she'd pushed away, every soft and steady lie told so it wouldn't cost her son a single bite of food, every night she'd convinced herself that surviving quietly was the same thing as actually living. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady in a completely different way than it had ever been steady before. "I'll let you." That night at supper, for the first time since Ben Collins died, Sarah Collins filled her own plate before anyone else's at the table. Noah watched her eat every single bite, and for once he didn't have to pretend not to notice, because there was nothing left between them worth hiding. Jack proposed properly a month later, on that same porch, with the whole valley turning green around them. Cedar Creek turned out for the wedding in numbers Martha Reed swore she'd never once seen for anybody's wedding before, biscuits included, and Tom Harper, of all people, gave a toast that made half the valley cry into their coffee. Noah stood beside his mother that day, older around the eyes than an 8-year-old boy should ever have to be, and finally, completely free of a promise that had always been too heavy for a child to carry alone. Sarah Collins spent a year of her life convinced that love and asking for help were opposite things, that keeping her family fed meant keeping her own hunger a secret from everyone who might otherwise have helped her carry it. That belief nearly cost her everything, including the very people she was working so hard to protect. What finally saved her wasn't charity handed down from above. It was somebody willing to notice quietly, offer honestly, and let her keep her dignity while she accepted the help she genuinely needed. That is the difference between charity that shames a person and community that actually heals one, and it's a difference worth remembering the next time someone close to you insists, a little too steadily, that they've already eaten. Join our growing family by subscribing, and don't forget to tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I truly enjoy meeting viewers from different places and seeing how far these Western stories have reached.